Greetings. Today, I'd like to talk about punctuation and how punctuation really is very helpful. Now, a little bit later on, we're going to be looking specifically at end marks. This is what the lesson is about, with periods, question marks, and exclamation points. But first, I just want to make a point about punctuation. It used to be, many years ago, say 2,000 years ago, that when people wrote in alphabetic languages, and back then would have been Hebrew, Greek, or Latin for the most part, they didn't even make a division between words when they wrote. It looked completely run on. This made it challenging, though, for people sometimes to understand exactly what was being said. But gradually, people began to make spaces or some kind of division between words, and then punctuation marks were added. I'm going to give you a little example here of the difference punctuation can make. Here is a letter written by Jill to someone, probably some poor guy named John, who, but we're not sure exactly what she means because the letter is unpunctuated. Now, depending on the punctuation, this letter can mean different things. First example, I want a man who knows what love is. All about you are generous, kind, and thoughtful people who are not like you. Admit to being useless and inferior. You have ruined me. For other men I yearn. For you, I have no feelings whatsoever. When we are apart, I can be forever happy. Will you let me be? Yours, Jill. Now, let's take a look at the same words, but punctuated differently. I want a man who knows what love is all about. You are generous, kind, and thoughtful. People who are not like you admit to being useless and inferior. You have ruined me for other men. I yearn for you. I have no feelings whatsoever when we are apart. I can be forever happy. Will you let me be yours, Jill? Same words, punctuation, very different. If you've come across this, you may have come across this. It's not original with me. It's from the book Eat, Shoots, and Leaves by Lynn Truss, which is a very entertaining book on the subject of punctuation. I recommend it to you. Okay, first punctuation mark, in fact it really probably was the first punctuation mark that people started using, was the period, simple dot. And periods end declarative sentences and requests or mild commands. And they also end indirect questions, which are really a kind of declarative sentence. Okay, here's the declarative sentence. Jesus rose from the dead. Okay, statement of fact, statement of something that happened, or whereas, but it's also true for opinions too. I like to study punctuation. Okay, that's a statement of opinion. I imagine there are probably a few people out there that, for some reason or another, don't like to study this. But again, it still ends with a period. It's still a declarative sentence. Okay, mild imperatives. Okay, seek first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added unto you. Okay, mild imperative. It's making a request. Okay, making a suggestion, perhaps. But they also end in a period. And then indirect questions, probably talk about these a little bit later, but refers to a question but doesn't really ask a question. Jesus asked his disciples what the people were saying. Okay, it really is a declarative sentence. It's about a question, but it's not specifically asking a question. So sometimes you call those indirect questions. Okay, periods are also used with abbreviations. They're used for most abbreviations except for acronyms and some common abbreviations which are pronounced. An acronym would be an abbreviation that is treated as a word. And sometimes even some things that are we refer to the letters are common enough that we often treat them as words, and sometimes you'll see those without the periods as well. So, for example, AM and PM, post meridian, afternoon, MPH, miles per hour, ETC, etc., and so on. These typical abbreviations, they end in period if they're made up of more than one word. The letter representing each word ends in a period. Acronyms and common abbreviations which are pronounced, words like NATO, OPEC, SCUBA, those are all abbreviations, but they're treated as words, so they normally don't have the periods after them or between the letters. And even sometimes words that are or abbreviations that are treated by the letters, sometimes they kind of treat them as a single word. Words like FBI or NFL or something like that, a lot of times you'll see those without the periods as well. For words like that, whichever way you choose, be consistent. So for FBI, if you use the periods throughout. If you don't use the periods, again, be consistent. Initials, F. Scott Fitzgerald, there's a period after the F. John F. Kennedy, a period after that F too. Titles, Mr., Dr., Mrs., Lieutenant, MD, LLC, and so on. I do mention that in the British Isles, the period is often omitted with titles that go before names, like Mr. and Mrs. and Doctor. But in the United States, it's still usual to have the period, and you can't go wrong using the period wherever you're writing. Okay, and then certain locations, abbreviations of things like road, street, state abbreviations. Here's abbreviation for Connecticut, USA. Now, sometimes people will say write USA without the periods because they treat it as a single word, kind of like FBI on the previous screen. And if you do it that way, again, just be consistent whichever way you choose. Abbreviations representing time are common with periods. AM, BC, AD, abbreviations for days of the week, for months of the year, and so on. Notice that the practice in bibliographies is to drop the period. Again, they try to keep the punctuation to a minimum, so you might have 10 February 2007, something like that. There, it's not, the abbreviation February does not end with a period. Normally it would. Obviously, in mathematical situations, periods are used to show decimals, 3.14159, etc. $2.75, and there's a period there. Note that in some European and Latin American countries, the comma is used to mark a decimal point instead of a period. So you might see 2.75 euros, but it means the same, 2 and 2 euros and 75 cents. Same idea, just some places they use the comma instead of the decimal point. If a sentence ends with an abbreviation, no additional period is needed. But if a sentence ends, an abbreviation requires a question mark or exclamation point, then you would add the question mark or exclamation point after the period. So this first sentence is incorrect. You don't need 2 periods. Just have the period. One period is enough for both the end of the sentence and the abbreviation. So please make the checkout to Roland and Payne, DDS 1. Period is all you need. Okay, then here you're going to have to move that a little bit so you can see it. If you're asking a question, do I make the checkout to Roland and Payne, DDS, then you would have the period for the abbreviation and then the question mark after that to show that you're asking a question. Okay, periods are also used in outlines. If you've done schoolwork and you've had to do outlines, you're probably familiar with that. For most of the levels, you can see the periods after the Roman numeral, after the letters, after the numbers. Sometimes if you get really fine divisions into outlines, they begin using parentheses, but that's unusual for most type of outlines. Okay, a period always comes before a closing quotation mark. So, as George said, I don't get it. Okay, the period comes before the closing question mark. This first one is incorrect. Practice in the British Isles may be a little different in some instances. Some authorities in the British Isles insist that if you're quoting something and the quotation does not include a period, then you don't include the period within the question mark. But that is not a real common practice, but I do mention that in case you come across that. Now, question marks end all direct questions. That includes incomplete questions and statements intended as questions. So, a direct question. Who do you say that I am? Okay. Who? Direct question, the subject and verb are reversed, which in English tells us it's a question. So it ends in a question mark. A lot of times we use incomplete questions. Somebody says something and we respond with a question. Really? When? No kidding. Okay. Those are all questions, if you think about it, questions as well. They might not be complete with a subject and verb, but they're intended as a question, so they end with a question mark. And then sometimes we have something that may look like a declarative sentence, but it's intended as a question. Usually there's a change in the tone of voice. So, your name is Fred? Okay. It's intended as a question, so it ends in a question mark. Now, sentences which describe questions but do not directly ask a question, I already talked about this a little bit, are called indirect questions, and they don't take a question mark. So this is incorrect. He asked if he could leave early. It's about the question. It's not asking the question. So he asked if he could leave early, ends with a period. However, if you quoted him and you said he asked, may I leave early, then of course you would have the question mark. And the question is directly quoted. So there would have the question mark. Sometimes you use question marks in parentheses after a point of fact to show uncertainty about it. This should be used sparingly and only for items that are really impossible to verify. So his great-great-grandfather, Nelson Bridger, I think that's his name, I'm not sure, really can't verify it, but family tradition says that's his name, supposedly fought in the Black Hawk War, okay, something like that, right? It's just something you can't really verify, so it goes in parentheses with the question mark. You see this a lot of times with dates, especially birth and death dates, where we're not sure when the person was born or when he died. So you might see Chaucer was born in 1343, and there's a question mark in parentheses afterwards. We don't know for sure exactly when he was born. I mean, back in those days, they didn't have birth certificates like they do today. So somewhere around that time. And notice the question mark used this way is not an end mark, so the statement would still have a period at the end after the parenthesis. Okay, exclamation points, or sometimes called exclamation marks, are used at the end of a sentence or after an interjection to show strong emotion or emphasis. So, the rain didn't stop for 4 days. Okay, put an exclamation point at the end. It means, when is it going to stop? You know, it's beginning to get to you. Okay, and then strong commands. Be back at 10 or else. Okay, you know, that or else, that emphasis, you know, needs more than just a period. And then interjections usually end with exclamation points. Not always, but usually they do. You know, wow! Oh my! Something like that. Ends with exclamation points. Now, exclamation points can be used near the beginning of a sentence. If you have a emphatic direct address, you may want to use an exclamation point, especially with an emphatic imperative sentence. You could say, John, come here. Mild command ends with a period, so you'd have John set off by a comma. John, come here! Okay, you're, in this case, the request or command is more emphatic, so it ends with an exclamation point. You really want to make emphasis, John, come here! Okay, both John and come here end with exclamation points. And similarly, it's similar with interjections as well, especially interjections like yes and no. Now, beware of overusing exclamation points. If you use them too frequently, it makes them less meaningful. Of course, having said that, some comic strips will use exclamation points in place of a period just to show the end of a sentence, because the periods don't always show up on comic strips. Okay. Occasionally you will see exclamation points inside of a period, inside of parentheses, to show irony. Now, the ironic tone should be clear, and so in that sense it's not really necessary, but some people will use this just for a little emphasis. Other authorities will say, by doing that, you're kind of showing that you don't think too much of your audience, like your audience can't figure out it's ironic on their own. So this would be very limited use at any rate. So here's an example. That butcher is a vegetarian. Okay, some people would include exclamation point in parentheses after the word butcher to show that this is ironic. I mean, after all, the guy is cutting up and selling meat, yet he doesn't eat it himself. Again, the punctuation is probably, probably not necessary, but it was, placed there to emphasize the irony. So, anyway, very simple for end marks, periods, used to end declarative sentences, mild commands, and indirect questions, also used in various occasions for abbreviations and in outlines. Question marks are used at the end of direct questions, whether it's a complete sentence or whether they're fragmentary questions like what, things like that. And then exclamation points are used for emphasis, and sometimes used with interjections frequently. It can be used at the beginning of a sentence as well as at the end of a sentence. Again, if you have any more questions about this, feel free to ask in class. If you're watching this and you're not in the class, go to the contact page at englishplus.com and someone will hopefully answer your question for you. Have a great day.